Welcome to Curious Curate. I'm so excited today to have our guest, Reverend Steven Wedgeworth, who is the rector of Christ Church in South Bend, Indiana. And today we're going to be discussing fencing the table, the practice of fencing the table as it was done historically in Anglicanism, and also just kind of the logic behind it, the pastoral theology that is fuels and informs the importance of fencing the table. So, Reverend Wedgeworth, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, let's just get into it. Fencing the table for just kind of beginning that conversation. What, what in short is fencing the table, and what are some maybe scriptural passages that inform that practice?
Yeah, so the expression fencing the table is a way to describe discipline and sort of proactive discipline around the sacrament of Holy Communion. So the idea is before people participate in communion, they are taught, perhaps sometimes warned, exhorted about what it is that they are about to participate in, what they're doing, and what the requirements are for faithful reception. Um, the classic passage is certainly 1 Corinthians chapter 11. There, the Apostle Paul is dealing with a pastoral problem at the church in Corinth. Appears that the rich are taking advantage of the poor, and they are creating divisions based on class and preference. And so the Apostle Paul says that you should examine yourself before you partake of the body and blood of Christ. So the idea of examining oneself before participating, that's where that comes from. Now that chapter, as I'm sure we'll say more, has got lots of scrutiny, many perspectives on that as we go. But that's the background of biblically. But it's funny now that I'm an Anglican to be talking about this because you might have thought that as the Presbyterian, I would be excited and pumped up about fencing the table. And becoming an Anglican, maybe we're past that. We don't care about that so much anymore. But honestly, with me, it's been the reverse. I'm probably more interested in it now that I'm an Anglican than I was in the past.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about that. So because what is it about maybe the Anglican context today? Maybe for those who don't know you, share a little bit about how recently you've kind of where you've come from into Anglicanism. For those who don't know, but then what was it about entering into the Anglican context that kind of renewed your interest in the topic, not the topic, but the actual practice of fencing the table?
Yeah. So I grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi, and we had a very traditional, at least the pastoral approach to fencing was very traditional there. You would always get a warning beforehand. The pastor would tell you that you need to examine yourself, that if you come to the table improperly or unworthily, you could be in danger of bringing judgment upon yourself, guilty of the body and blood of our Lord. And so that was in my formation. Now, as a Baptist, that tended to be connected with the idea of a personal conversion. And so the idea was, if you're not converted, don't come to the table. So examining oneself tended to be a time to examine whether or not you were saved. So that was that background. And as I moved into a more reformed and eventually Presbyterian position, I struggled with that. Even though the Presbyterians have a long tradition of fencing, I struggled with it because I didn't have that same theology of conversion anymore. It didn't make sense to me to be constantly calling out to everyone in the room, especially in small churches where you had a certain knowledge of each other. All of these baptized people who had been receiving the ordinary means of grace. It didn't make sense for me in my mind to just be constantly warning all of them that they might not be saved. That seemed to just kind of jar with the covenant theology that we otherwise practiced.
Right.
I don't mean to say that you would never challenge someone's spiritual status, but as a general statement to the whole congregation, that just seemed kind of odd. And there has been a movement away from fencing the table in so, as a Presbyterian and then getting into other ideas, sort of liturgical renewal movement things, I kind of pushed away from fencing. I thought that
Hmm.
that was maybe an artifact of an overly scrupulous discipline, maybe Puritanism or something. And so I wasn't following that same approach to piety, that same approach to spirituality. So I moved away from fencing, and I think there was also a very optimistic, we might even say overly optimistic idea out there that the whole point of coming to the table is to maximize unity. And so, in order to maximize unity, you want as many people participating as possible. So all of that was in the background. So I was really not big on fencing at the time. I thought maybe you would fence just purely on a occasional basis, one on one, outside of the church. Um, and I wasn't really challenged on that until becoming an Anglican.
Hmm.
Becoming an Anglican is what made me reevaluate all of this. Now, you might say, how in the world can that be? Aren't Anglicans what you just described, and even more so? Aren't they
Right.
really, really big on unity at the table, inviting everyone, kind of an open posture? Um, and that might be true. Might be true for a lot of Anglicans and ACNA people. I'd have to hear everyone's experience, but of course, the church that I came to has the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. Nice little green book here, the international edition. Um, and so that's what I had to learn. And if you turn to the communion liturgy in the 1662, the first thing you find is a page of rubrics, and it's all about fencing the table. As many as intend to be partakers of the Holy Communion shall signify their name to the pastors at least sometime the day before. So, the old practice is that you actually had to meet with the pastor and let them know you intended to commune. And then it talks about all of the cases in which the pastor might tell someone not to participate. Um, and of course, there's the old rule that if you do tell someone not to participate, then you have to report that to the bishop within 2 weeks. So, so that was interesting right away. Okay, there's all of this information about fencing the table, huh? Well, maybe that's just an artifact. That's old stuff. I'll keep it in my mind, but I'm still mulling this over. Um, but then you actually do the liturgy, you do the communion liturgy. And as you get to the section right after the sermon and the tithe and the prayer for the church, um, there's an exhortation built into the prayer book. Dearly beloved, ye that mind to come to the Holy Communion, the body and blood of our Savior Christ, must consider how St. Paul exhorteth all persons diligently approve and examine themselves. So there it is. If I'm going to be a prayer book conformist, if I'm going to follow what the public liturgy of the church over the centuries has taught, I've got an exhortation prior to communion. I have
Yeah.
a fencing of the table. And so I just had to do it.
Hmm.
Here it is. You've got to do it.
Yeah.
Um, Now, I really like the exhortation in the BCP. I think that it has a little bit of a corrective to that older model that I was describing.
Hmm.
It doesn't simply say, hey, you all out there, you might not be saved.
Right.
Use this time to figure that out. Um, it's much more about lifestyle, how you've been conducting yourself. Are you following the commandments of God currently? And it begins with the warning, with the law, and then it moves to the end of the exhortation to talking about the work of Christ.
Hmm.
And so it has a bit of a law gospel form, even in the exhortation. Um, and it ends with a call to confess your sins. And so while there might be people who hear the exhortation and decide that they are not ready, they need to abstain, uh, it would naturally incline most of the people in the room to say, well, yes, I have sinned. I have committed error and fallen away in certain parts. And so now I'm going to confess my sins. And then the liturgy leads you to that great general confession that you'll all
Right.
do prior to communion.
Yeah.
So it's not simply a discouragement.
Hmm.
It's a warning, but then it gives you a guide and a way to then move forward and participate rightly.
Yeah, that's that's really helpful. So I mean, it's also interesting to see that you just, you picked up the 1662, you're learning how to lead a communion service and you see the rubrics and it's right there. And
Yeah.
and so with that expectation of meeting and this is just helpful kind of to just sit in the historical for a little bit about how we're getting a glimpse of that. But so if a someone had to meet with their pastor beforehand, um, what did that have to? What did that? How did that look normally in the life of a local parish? Did that have implications on frequency of Holy Communion being administered? Um, and if so, was that viewed as a detriment, or was there a balance of other things? Like what did it look like? What did it look like for the first few hundred years and after the English Reformation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we have different examples when we look at the church in practice. It seems like there was an idea early on that most or all churches would be having weekly communion. Certainly, your premier churches, your cathedral churches, the chapels associated with the schools, they would be having weekly communion. Um, but we also see that this was not true for every parish church.
Mm.
And certainly by the time you get to the canons of 1604 under King James, and then later on into the 1662 and so forth, the settlement seemed to be that the cathedrals and the seminaries and colleges, they would have weekly communion, but the parish churches would have maybe monthly or maybe even sometimes quarterly communion. And that practice would vary according to region. Um, when you move forward into America, from my studies, it seemed to be pretty common in the 19th century for churches to do monthly.
Mhm.
And that would be true even of people we called high church, unless they were a cathedral. They would probably have monthly as well.
Yeah.
Now, some of that is perhaps uh, you know ideological, like this is the best way to do it spiritually. A lot of it was probably practical,
Yeah.
because as you mentioned, if you've got to meet with people, you've got to talk about this in advance. It takes some time. Additionally, we don't think about this too much anymore, but it may not have been so easy for small churches, for rural churches, to have wine and fresh bread for their people all the time. You're living in a time where you can't just go to the supermarket on Saturday. You're probably making the bread yourself, and you're procuring the wine at some cost. The 1662 has a funny little rubric that says the church wardens have to make sure that they can pay for the bread and the wine.
Yeah.
So it comes from their cost.
And the curate
so
gets to
so they could
take
have
the
been a real.
unconsecrated host home, on the unconsecrated
That's right.
bread home. And as a curate, I don't come home with loaves of bread, unfortunately, but I would
Yeah,
have
that's right. Yeah,
if
the
we.
older rubrics say any unconsecrated bread that the ministers can take with them. So yeah, that shows you there was a little bit of a challenge or a burden to have that sometimes. So it's just a different world, and we have to understand that. Yeah, some of the
Yeah.
conditions can affect our practice.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful, and I think I imagine that post liturgical renewal, there might be this idea implicitly that the less frequently you have communion, the lower your Eucharistic theology is. And I would just love you to maybe address that, potential is that a misunderstanding? Was there a lower view of Holy Communion because it was done more infrequently, or was it not?
And that's definitely a bias. If you don't have it every week, you must not think it's important. Um, I don't think that needs to follow even just prima facie, because what I encountered again in my previous eras, in a weekly communion setting, there was frequently the argument that we do weekly communion because it's ordinary, it's normal, it's a regular part of the service. Um, I use that argument, just like we do all the other elements of service, we do the communion. Um, Someone who doesn't do communion every week would actually argue communion is really, really special.
Hmm.
So, we
Yeah.
since it's not here every week, when it's here, it's a big deal. Um, and in the older BCPs, they actually have exhortations that you read the week prior to let people know communion is coming. And you have two choices there. You have the one that's very kind of stern and getting everyone to be really serious and get ready. And then there's another one to use if you expect that the people would avoid communion. And so it's a call that this is such an important, necessary thing. The master of the feast is inviting you. How would you turn him down? um,
Yeah.
so the fact that it's not every week actually was used to show how important and significant and urgent it was.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the shift, because I think for those listeners who might be new to Anglicanism, might have just, have entered into the Anglican world for the first time in the 21st century, I think this conversation, for the most part, sounds very foreign. Um,
Yeah.
and so, what was the shift? And let's just talk about first when did this shift, and what were the reasonings for the shift, and then perhaps we can discuss maybe what were some of the ramifications of that shift on a pastoral level. But what happened, and how long was this the practice in Anglicanism, and when did it change, and what were some of the reasons for that change?
Yeah. Okay. So you've asked me a bunch of topics
Yes,
here, some of which I feel better about being able to answer than others.
sure.
So I'll start with the last couple of questions. From my studies, which are not I'm not the most studied on this topic, but I have been focusing on it and reading about it for the last 3 or 4 years now. Um, it appears to me that this arrangement that I described, your cathedral churches, your big churches, your churches maybe with lots of clergy, them doing it weekly, but your smaller churches, kind of neighborhood or rural parish churches doing it monthly or quarterly, that seems to be the majority practice in England and America, in Ireland, in Australia, kind of all over. Certainly by the middle of the 17th century until the early 20th century. That seems to be the case, and even today in the ACNA, my understanding is the Falls Church in Virginia, they don't have communion every week, and that's not a new thing. They didn't
Hmm.
decide to stop having it weekly, but they are rather continuing the practice that they had, as Virginia Anglicans. Um, I also know that's very common in Ireland. If you see old country churches, Church of Ireland, Protestant churches, they'll have advertised outside on the church sign, morning prayer on the first, second, and third Sunday, or first and third Sunday, and then communion on the other Sundays. So I do think it was a historic thing. Um, why the shift? Probably a few reasons. Um, I do think you had very, very low churchmen. You had modernists. You had people that just they didn't actually enjoy having communion. They had all sorts of reasons not to do it, and some of them would make it very infrequent. 4 times a year or maybe twice a year. 3 times a year, I think, is required in the canons of 1604. So that would show you that to make a law, you have to do it at least 3 times. There could have been some people out there that were reluctant to do it that frequently. So I do think there are people that just did not want to do it for various reasons. It fell into a low estate as far as observance. Um, and we know there were tons of churches that just adopted the means and methods of the Great Awakenings. You see that in some of the low churches in the Reformed Episcopal Church history. I know they've got some of that in their history. Um, and so that was an issue. People seeing how it was kind of devalued or not properly observed. So you had reactions and corrections to that. Then you have your high church movement into the 18th and 19th century, and some of those people, they advocated for daily communion. And it can surprise you which people were doing this. I was reading about John Wesley, and when he was in school and seminary, he and his companions, they were doing daily communion services. Now we think of Wesley eventually as a Methodist, a revivalist, but he actually came out of that high church world. And so I do think you had a high church press, and they could contrast themselves against the very, very low church. So we do it every week to correct that. And then probably the early to middle 20th century, what really wins the day is you do have what's called the parish communion movement. And this is part of the larger liturgical renewal movement. And this is just the idea that I kind of alluded to earlier. Every church should be having communion every week as a normal, ordinary part of its service. And with that also came the idea that everybody should be participating. So every church is having communion every week, and everyone at church is participating in communion. And there was a theory behind this that would revitalize, that would strengthen people's piety. Some people would go so far as to even say it was a converting ordinance. So your altar call,
Yeah.
the call to come to communion really is a call to conversion. So I've been in churches, not Anglican ones, but I've been in churches that do that, where they say, hey, if you're out there and maybe you don't know what you think about God, or you're not walking with the Lord, now's your chance. Come down and participate with us and meet Jesus. So you can see how dramatically the activity can change your meaning, your intent. So I do think that open communion model really paired well with the weekly and every church communion philosophy. Those went together. And that's still a pretty common thing you encounter amongst liturgical churches.
Hmm. So that's a helpful history, and I think that's an important note, because it just seems to have been law in most, I think, mainstream kind of Anglican circles. This information is probably just kind of almost unknown. But I'd love to hear about maybe a pastoral perspective on fencing the table. Um, what do you see as the value of it coming from a place of more of ordinary, very ordinary, weekly kind of approach? What is the pastoral value to fencing the table, and what does that look like in your context using the prayer book?
Yeah. So there's really two things we could talk about. We could talk about the fencing of the table, and then we could talk about whether you're having it the Lord's Supper every week or not. Those are technically two separate things. We'll stick with the fencing for now. In my previous experience of very low fencing or no fencing, I started to notice there was an idea popping up, and I didn't teach this. This wasn't being, expounded anywhere, but it just seemed to kind of follow from the practice that everyone had sort of an inherent right to come to the table. And if anyone would maybe decide for people not to come, it would just be the head of the household or something. He would take it upon himself. I know what's going on, and I'll make the decision. And so there was this real rejection that the ministers, that the clergy had a role to play in admitting or preventing access. And then that kind of spiraled into just a disregard for church discipline in general. And if you think about it, if the pastors can't fence or gatekeep, then their discipline really is very limited. It's just words, just admonitions. If you don't have the right to actually stop someone from communing, then you've really lost a lot of what it means to have discipline. So I was experiencing kind of an abuse that came from low fencing and no fencing that just essentially was more or less rejecting the concept of church discipline, a low view of the ministry, really. And that's ironic because, these are, communion maxers, Holy Sacrament enjoyers. But they don't really value the clergy and the ministry having a role as watchmen there. So that was a problem. But also now moving into the Anglican context, I've also just observed a difference in kind of who shows up at church. So in my older experience, the churches were, in my experience, they were smaller churches. I mean, the largest church I've ever been at, still only had about 200 people, in the room at one time. But I've been in many churches that were, 40 to 50 people, and that's just all that's ever going to be in the room. And everyone kind of knew each other, and even if a new person showed up, you could pretty well expect they had already done their homework. They knew what they were looking for. They had a checklist of all the distinctives. Um, and I found that that's actually very different here at our church, Christ Church in South Bend. We're still a small church. We're not a big church, but we're by God's grace attracting visitors. We're in a college town, so we get students who are looking, and they're typically in some process of spiritual pilgrimage, moving from one place to another.
Mhm.
We also just get people who are there for the concept of liturgy. They want to find some sort of traditional worship. They've seen the web page. The building looks pretty. They want to check it out. Um, and I've also found a lot of people who come to our church. They don't have a lot of doctrinal formation on the front end. They tended to be Christians. We've had non-Christians visit, of course, but in general, most people that visit are already Christians. But they could be from all walks of life. We have people at our church who grew up Seventh-day Adventist. We have nominal lapsed Catholics who are coming back to the faith. We have had, people that were Baptist, but became Russian Orthodox, and then were Pentecostal. Just from everywhere. And I've had Mormons visit, or ex-Mormons, so
Wow.
not Orthodox Christians at that point. But again, that shows you the breadth there. And it'd be nice to think, well, okay, like they know the basics. They know not to participate if they're not, baptized, and if they haven't been following the Lord, or they're not walking in God's commandments. But honestly, no,
Mm.
that's not a safe assumption anymore. People don't know that. And so I do feel a pastoral responsibility. I need to give some guidance here. I need to give some statement about what we expect. And just saying if you're baptized, then you can commune, I feel like that's insufficient because, I mean, all these people are baptized, but they're still all over the place. Their doctrine maybe is unformed. They might have just been starting to get back right with God. One guy, actually, a few weeks ago, he didn't try to participate in communion, so it wasn't a problem, but I talked with him afterwards. He had actually been excommunicated at his most recent
Wow.
church. And this is a guy who was baptized, and he's starting to get back into being interested. He wants to plug back into church, but he's in a state of excommunication. And so, I feel like there's some duty there for me to say a few words. Um, and so my choices are I can make it up. I can write my own statement. I can off the cuff, um, or I can use what's in the prayer book, right?
Yeah.
um, Now, I say I have the choice. I'm speaking in the grandest of theory terms. Obviously, at my church, the leadership, they want me to follow the prayer book. So it's not that every week I'm deciding whether or not to follow the prayer book, but in general, just as a theoretical point of view, those are my options. If I
Right.
want to be responsible, I have to say something. So I can say whatever comes to mind in the moment. I can write my own text, or I can use the exhortation in the BCP.
So do
And at this
you
point, I think the BCP would be better than anything I could come up with.
yeah. So do you require confirmation or desire for confirmation at your church to receive?
That is the general rule. I do wiggle a little bit, and I say something like, if you're not confirmed, but you've done the equivalent of confirmation in your church tradition, so I'll allow for that, and I'll usually make that statement in the parish notices. So I'm not saying that in the liturgy itself. Um, because we have a lot of people who aren't episcopally confirmed. They haven't visited a bishop to have the hands laid on them, but they maybe did make a public profession of faith to their relevant authorities. They go before the elders or the other ministers of the church, and have probably been in the habit of communing. And so I don't want to send a sectarian denominational statement. You Presbyterians or you Baptists out there, you Lutherans who have had communion before, who have made a profession of faith, who are trying to meet all of these requirements I'm talking about. I don't want to say you're out, because the point is not simply to police one's turf, but it's to pastorally exhort them to receive rightly.
Mm. And so what do you think is the how have you seen that? So you mentioned how there was that movement of having every church having communion weekly with the hope of renewal, and I imagine that happened um, before the Episcopal Church kind of fully went south in the late 20th century. So clearly that doesn't is not a one to one, that the more you commune, the more life there is. But I'm curious, how is fencing the table fostered pastoral relationships? How have you seen that specific act of fencing the table actually benefit the spiritual growth of those in your parish? Because I can imagine that there's people that think that that's so exclusive and it's not loving. But I'm curious if you have positive testimonies of how that practice has been a benefit in your church.
Yes, yeah, I have. I've overheard a number of interesting conversations. The first thing is it does just start the conversation. People say, "Wait, what? Why is he saying this? Where is this coming from?" Um, it also highlights the role of the law, the Ten Commandments. Again, this is somewhere where your more modern prayer books maybe have gotten you on the wrong track. But in the older prayer books, every communion service would open with the reading of the Ten Commandments. And you'd read each commandment, and then the congregation would respond, "Lord, have mercy upon us, and incline our hearts to keep this law." And you say, "Well, why are we doing that? Why do we have to do that every service?" Well, in one of the exhortations, it tells you. It says the way to be ready and a right partaker of the communion is to examine your life according to each commandment and to order your conduct according to God's law. So the exhortation is a reinforcement of the Ten Commandments, that we apply them to our life.
Yeah.
And then when you do the Ten Commandments in the liturgy, it's not just a back and forth. It's not an opportunity to recite things, but you are actually pondering God's moral standard
Mm.
and each commandment. The reason they're separated like that is to give you the time to hear each one and to think about it. And you say, "Whoa, have I taken the Lord's name in vain this last week?" Or did I keep the Sabbath? And wait, Sabbath? What? Hold on a minute here. I didn't know we had to talk about Sabbath. So that's a whole conversation. And children can decide if they've properly honored their parents. Sexual morality, goodness, isn't that a need to be regularly confronted with?
Mm.
So, so the exhortation is given a new role in life to the law.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's also I've also seen fruit in that it does serve not quite as an altar call. We're not quite in that zone, but it actually serves as a sort of renewal in and of itself. I mean, it is a time, especially if it's the week prior, so we haven't had communion, and so it's an exhortation prior. It is this summoning about, okay, let's get serious. Let's really take some time now to inspect ourselves, to reorder, and it can be an evangelistic tool. Um, when I first got to our church, one of the things that we did, we were trying to focus on outreach and growth. Our vestry read Tim Keller's book, Center Church. And it was interesting. In that book, he said, if you can do a pre-communion exhortation, that can be a really powerful means of evangelism.
Hmm.
And we all looked at each other in the room and smiled because we have the text to do that. I mean, it literally is an evangelistic device, and there it is. You don't have to go out and buy some box curriculum. You don't have to think of some new idea to reach people. Just using the communion exhortation is a powerful evangelistic tool. And coming in the liturgy gives it extra weight and extra gravity.
Yeah.
And again, the fact that I didn't write it myself, but everyone knows that this is actually text with centuries behind it, with the approval of the church, that adds further weight to what we're doing.
That's really helpful. As I, I, I think you were talking about how sometimes weekly communion can kind of lower subconsciously can give someone a lower view of the minister, um, and their authority. And I imagine that if somebody like myself who's pursuing ordination who's been in that environment too, might also begin to assume or in, internalize kind of what the capacity is for a minister when it comes to Eucharistic practice. When it comes to you as a minister and the ordination and the vows you made in your ordination, particularly when the ordinand to the priesthood is encouraged to be a watchman. How do you see your ordination vows and fencing the table and your duties kind of intertwine from your perspective
Yeah.
as a clergyman?
Well, that's right. Yeah, there are at least two relevant vows here, and I was thinking about those in preparation for this conversation. One of those, the bishop says to the person being ordained, "Will you then give your faithful diligence always so to minister the doctrine and sacraments and the discipline of Christ, as the Lord hath commanded, and as this church has received the same." So we have to actually vow to minister doctrine, sacraments, and discipline. That's
Mm.
part of what we have to do. Um, and then there's that other one that follows, the other vow: "Will you be ready with all faithful diligence to banish and drive away all erroneous and strange doctrine, contrary to God's word, and to use both public and private admonition and exhortation, as well to the sick as to the whole within your cure."
Mm.
So I have to use public exhortation as well as private exhortation. And I have to use it to those who are whole, those who appear to be okay, and those who I know to be spiritually sick.
Yeah.
Um, and I would just, I'd ask people, how do you do that without some kind of fixed rule, some sort of plan? Again, it's nice to think we would just always figure it out. We can always intuit the need, and the words just come. But that's not really my experience.
Yeah.
And to be frank, my personality is not a John the Baptist personality.
Hmm.
We just had that reading this past Sunday in Advent, the
Yeah.
ministers of the church being like John the Baptist. That's not who I am natively. I'd rather just be in my office reading a book. I like to do relational ministry where you and me get coffee.
Sure.
We talk like that. And so to have a device for public exhortation and admonition is super helpful. It doesn't need to be the full extent of my exhorting and admonishing. I have to be able to do more than that when the cause is there. But it's very, very helpful to have something that I can use as a normal, ordinary way to do that.
Well, that's yeah. I mean, that's really helpful to have that device, almost that kind of barrier you can appeal to the prayer book, and it's not like you're just yourself, just declaring
Yeah.
on your own. There's this channel, this vehicle by which to do that. As we kind of close, I have kind of two questions. Um, the first one, both are in the context of just how different Anglicanism is today in this practice of fencing the table because of some changes of liturgically. And the reason I think frequency is related to fencing, they don't have to be, is that um, oftentimes there's just the weekly communion. There is just a lack of fencing explicitly, but I know they don't have to be related. But for someone who is attending, um, I guess let's start on the clergy side of things. I keep encountering um, clergy who are discovering the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, not just the prayer book, but just um, the primary sources and learning. If someone's in like a 2019 kind of context, what are some practical ways? And they just kind of done the way things have been done as they were formed in the Episcopal Church post liturgical movement. What are some practical ways to kind of move the needle back to that earlier vision? Just some practical things that they might be able to do over a
Yeah.
over a patient journey, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So one challenge that I always meet is the concern about how long the service is going to
Oh,
be.
yes, that's a massive, massive
Um,
one, I hear.
yeah, people are very worried about that. And of course, if you're doing communion in a sizable church, then that's a time chunk built right in. When we have a communion service, let's say it's a holiday, Easter, so we have over 100 people. That's big for us to have more than 100 people. And if I preach and I'm like on my game and I'm keeping that sermon to 20 to 25 minutes, which is the shortest I've ever preached in my entire life. If I can do that, but I still have a communion service for 100 people, then the total length of our service following the BCP liturgy is going to be an hour and a half, probably. And depending on how many songs you choose and how your tempo of your singing, any other pauses or ad libs, you could easily be in the territory of 2 hours. Um, you know, so there's some concern about that. I understand. So I do think you have to ask those questions. Um, is our commitment to a certain time period proper and essential? If you're just operating this idea, it's got to be an hour. well, then I think that's a problem. Like you just need to get over that. But I can understand 2 hours. That's hard. That's a big
Yeah.
ask. So you have to ask those questions. Figure out your time period. And let's say you're locked into boundaries, like we are at our church. We can only be in the room for an hour and a half is actually too long. We need to be done sooner than that. And so that's one reason we don't do communion every week here, as we do have that time crunch. So we can do morning prayer and get that done much more comfortably. I can even preach longer in a morning prayer service. I can preach closer to 30 minutes and still respect our time limit there. And so that's one reason we don't do weekly communion, because of the time constraint. Now, some people that's going to be, inconceivable and unacceptable. I understand. So let's say you're going to do communion, but you have the time constraint. You do have to ask some questions. How much music is necessary? I love music. I'm not anti-music, but you may need to cut out a hymn or rearrange the hymn. Special music, that sort of stuff. Is that essential, or is that extraneous? Are you doing other extra ceremonies that aren't necessarily in the liturgy? That's also something to look into. And then sermon discipline. Probably the churches that are going to struggle with my message today, they probably also already have short sermons. But yeah, keeping the sermon in a proportion. I think you need to have good sermons. They need to be weighty and exegetical. Even if they are lectionary, which is what I tend to do, they should still exegete the scripture. But yeah, I think you can still do a good job of that in under 30 minutes, 25 minutes. It's a challenge, but it's possible. So monitoring the length. And then let's say you're still doing everything you can, but you just can't imagine doing these exhortations. Well, start with a careful, a principled, abbreviated exhortation. Just try that.
Mm.
Take what's in the BCP and then see what you can sort of whittle away to make it a little bit shorter, so that you can still do it. Um, and that would be a decent start. An abbreviated exhortation is better than no exhortation. Uh, and you'll learn how to read it. That's something that I've really tried to focus on. What are the ways my reading of the liturgy, volume, pace, when I pause, when to change my tone of voice, all of that will also affect how it goes over.
Sure.
And so working on the actual reading of the liturgy and the exhortation is really important as well.
Yeah.
Um, and then I would say just a commitment to actually trying it out for an appropriate duration. If you do it once and people react and that wasn't good, that was weird, well, that's kind of to be expected. If you've never done this before, if this is a foreign practice, then it's going to take some getting used to. So I would
Right.
say committing to doing it enough that you give it an honest shot. You see how it actually goes over. Um, and then explaining it, why you're doing it, backing it up with some teaching, both from the scriptures and from the other parts of our formularies. What we talked about earlier in this episode.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those are helpful tips. Yeah, the time the time is always a challenge, from parishes I've been around. That's a barrier. What about for an individual who hears this maybe and is in a context where they don't hear the exhortation, or communion is pretty, regular, ordinary, but in what's some ways they can enliven, or prepare, have that posture that the 1662 prayer book has, in their own personal lives, even if the liturgy doesn't reflect that older way of doing things? How can an individual prepare their hearts better, as if the table were going to be fenced?
Yeah. Well, I think doing it in advance is very important. You could go through the Ten Commandments, reading it, meditating over them the night before or the morning of. The International Edition actually has some additional prayers in the appendix. So they've collected prayers that have been in other prayer books or written by other writers, and there's 3 or 4 prayers to be used for preparation for receiving the sacrament. And I found them to be quite good. one of them's very, very intense. It kind of goes through all the possible ways you may have offended God, and um, as I get older, I have more of an appreciation for that.
Mm,
I don't roll my eyes at the
mm,
thought of being deemed too scrupulous. Uh, Really the opposite. I think I probably have been raised in a world that is very, very light. It takes
mm,
things very casually, um, and I need to recover more of a sense of gravitas over this. So,
mm.
preparation in advance, night before, morning of, reading the scriptures, and even during the time of ministration. If you're not in line to receive, you can be in your pew praying and meditating as well.
Yeah, those are helpful tips. Reverend Wedgeworth, thank you so much for joining me today and discussing this topic. It probably seems a little obscure, but I think it's important, and I'm glad that you shared about your experience and kind of about the 1662 Book of Common Prayer and what it looks like. And I hope people listening can imagine that this is a possibility, and maybe at least reinvigor and encourage them as they approach Holy Communion. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the idea, David. This was good, and yeah, if people out there are interested, please find ways to reach out. You can check my church's webpage to contact me, Christ Church South Bend, and we would love to talk about this more. And yeah, we'd love to see more of our churches using the exhortation in the liturgy.
Yeah.